friends. Thank you for joining me today. We are living in remarkable times, moments that peel back the veil and reveal the true workings of power in this nation. It is now evident that Mr. Trump is in a far worse position than even I anticipated. Before dismissing this as just political commentary, it is important to view the situation from an economist's lens, not a partisan one. What we are witnessing is not simply the collapse of one individual's political career, but a sign of a much deeper crisis within the American system. Trump's struggles are not merely legal, though those are substantial. They are fundamentally structural. He represents the profound anger and disillusionment of millions of Americans who have been betrayed by an economic system that promised prosperity, but instead gave insecurity, debt, and a declining quality of life. For decades, the working class, across racial lines, has been steadily squeezed, while a small elite accumulated vast wealth. Trump skillfully positioned himself as the voice of that frustration. But the core contradiction is that he is a product of the very system his followers despise. His entire life, his wealth, fame, and business operations are deeply embedded in the corporate capitalist structure that has long undermined the working people. Now, that contradiction is catching up with him. His challenges are growing not only because of legal pressure from courts and prosecutors, but because the cracks in his public image are becoming too large to ignore. The persona of the billionaire outsider can only last as long as the public believes he is not part of the establishment. But with every new indictment, every revelation of dubious financial dealings, and every attempt to dodge responsibility, he is exposed as what he truly is. Not an outsider, but an insider who exploited the system until it turned on him. When that illusion fades, and his supporters realize that he is as entrenched in corruption as the very figures he decries, a political shift is inevitable. What makes Trump's current situation so dire is that his supporters backed him precisely because they believed he was not part of the establishment. They believed he was there to challenge the system. Now, with each indictment, every court appearance, and every fresh allegation, the illusion of his independence is crumbling. This shift gradually redefines Trump from a populist hero to just another member of the establishment. For a political figure who thrives on symbolism, this transformation is devastating. The real problem is the steady erosion of trust among his most devoted supporters. For years, Trump deflected scandal after scandal by framing them as attacks from a corrupt elite bent on silencing him. This narrative worked as long as people believed he was fundamentally different from those elites. However, as his business dealings, tax records, and political maneuvers come to light, the line between Trump and the establishment he opposed becomes increasingly indistinct. He begins to seem less like a victim of the system and more like an active participant in it. Once this shift in perception takes hold, and his supporters begin to doubt the man they trusted is not who he claimed to be, the foundation of his political identity begins to crumble. That's why his troubles go beyond legal matters. They strike at the very heart of his political legitimacy. Throughout history, leaders who have based their rise to power on the narrative of defiance and outsider status have often seen their influence crumble once these narratives were proven to be false. When the public realizes that the so-called outsider is actually an insider, the illusion shatters. Trump's wealth, once seen as a sign of independence that supposedly shielded him from corruption, now increasingly looks like proof of the same kind of elitist backdoor deals he criticized in his opponents. The deeper, structural nature of Trump's issues is evident in the intense polarization and division that now define the United States. A healthy political and economic system should mediate conflicts, balance competing interests, and create stability. What we're witnessing, however, is growing division with Trump serving both as a symbol and a catalyst of this trend. His supporters view him as their champion, while his critics see him as the embodiment of corruption and authoritarianism. This rift didn't happen overnight. It's the result of years of declining public trust in institutions, expanding inequality, and a systemic failure to address the country's core needs. As a result, Trump's personal challenges are inseparable from the wider crisis of governance and legitimacy in the U.S. The legal proceedings against him further emphasize these systemic issues. A former president facing multiple charges would have been unthinkable in the past, but today it seems like a natural outcome of a system unraveling due to its own contradictions. Moreover, the fact that some view this legal process as justice and others as persecution highlights a society no longer united in its understanding of law, justice, or truth. When trust in fundamental institutions deteriorates so deeply, the legal troubles of a major political figure like Trump transcend personal issues and become collective flashpoints. They reveal the vulnerability of these foundational systems and how easily they could collapse further. Even the media's role in amplifying Trump's story reflects this underlying weakness. An information system that once aimed to inform and hold power accountable has, in many cases, become driven by profit, engagement metrics, and spectacle. For years, Donald Trump's most potent weapon has been the carefully crafted image of himself as an outsider, someone fundamentally different from the political class. He portrayed himself as untouched by Washington's corruption, untainted by the compromises of career politicians, and uniquely equipped to fight for those left behind by the system. This illusion resonated deeply with working-class Americans who had seen political promises dissolve into economic hardship, job outsourcing, rising living costs, and a paralyzed government. Trump didn't need to prove he was one of them. He just had to convince them that he was battling the same elites they despised. It was this powerful image that propelled him to the White House. However, even the most convincing illusions must eventually confront reality. And the reality now unfolding reveals Trump not as an opponent of the establishment, but as a figure firmly entrenched within it. This unraveling began quietly, with reports highlighting his intricate business dealings and his connections to influential corporate elites. It has since snowballed, fueled by a growing number of legal challenges that expose the precise methods he used to accumulate wealth and power. The populist image starts to disintegrate as supporters realize that Trump, much like the elites he constantly criticized, has a long history of exploiting loopholes, bypassing regulations, and using his position for personal benefit at the expense of others. The outsider narrative collapses as the evidence mounts, showing he was always playing by the insider's playbook. The man who once energized crowds with promises to drain the swamp is now increasingly seen as a product of that very swamp, sustained by the same networks of privilege and power he claimed to oppose. This unraveling of his image also exposes a broader truth about populism itself. Trump wasn't the first, nor will he be the last, political figure to use anti-elitist rhetoric, while simultaneously relying on elite structures to maintain power. What sets Trump apart, however, is how much more overtly and heavily he depended on this strategy. His blatant defiance of political norms, constant references to the forgotten American, and relentless attacks on establishment figures led many to believe he was truly in a league of his own. But populism without substance is ultimately unsustainable. When the rhetoric doesn't align with action and promises of systemic reform are contradicted by private dealings, the illusion inevitably shatters. And when it does, the disillusionment is deep and widespread. This disillusionment is critical, as it affects not just Trump's image, but the larger political system. For many of his followers, Trump symbolized the last hope that the system could be challenged from within. If he turns out to be just like the elites he decried, the resulting anger may not just target him, but the entire political structure. This frustration could lead to apathy, political disengagement, or a search for an even more extreme figure who can keep the illusion alive. In any case, the fall of Trump's outsider persona represents more than the decline of a single politician. It marks a crucial moment in the ongoing legitimacy crisis that characterizes American politics. The image that sustained Trump wasn't rooted in policy achievements or institutional credibility, but in the belief that he was fundamentally different. As that image fades under the weight of evidence, legal battles, and public scrutiny, Trump faces a crisis far more profound than any legal outcome could signify. Losing his outsider identity strips him of the very essence that made him a formidable political force, reducing him to just another member of the establishment he once so vocally opposed. The anger that fueled Trump's rise isn't going to disappear with his legal troubles and the crumbling of his outsider image. This anger has never been about Trump himself. It is about the real-life conditions of millions of working people across America who feel overlooked, deceived, and robbed of their dignity. Trump didn't create this anger. He became its embodiment. His skill lay in his ability to tap into it, magnify it, and position himself as its true representative. Yet, the root causes of this frustration, stagnant wages, insecure jobs, soaring healthcare costs, crushing debt, and the constant battle to afford housing and basic needs, remain as potent as ever. These aren't issues confined to the fortunes of a single politician. They are the enduring results of an economic system that has failed to meet its promises for the majority, and they will continue to dominate American politics, regardless of Trump's future. This anger among working Americans is deeply entrenched in decades of economic change. For the past 40 years, the idea of prosperity through hard work has been at odds with the reality of diminishing economic mobility. The offshoring of entire industries left countless communities hollowed out, replacing stable, well-paying jobs with low-wage, insecure service work. The influence of unions, once a vital counterbalance to corporate power, shrank considerably, stripping workers of bargaining power and protection. At the same time, the cost of essential services skyrocketed. Higher education, once a reliable route to opportunity, became attainable only through a lifetime of crippling debt. Healthcare, once a basic need, transformed into a major source of financial distress. Housing markets inflated to the point where entire generations have been shut out. These are not passing issues. They are structural elements of modern American capitalism. What must be understood clearly is that this widespread anger is a logical response, not an irrational one. It is the inevitable reaction of people whose legitimate hopes have been methodically undermined by an economic system that funnels wealth and power to the top while spreading insecurity among everyone else. To dismiss this anger as ignorance or prejudice, as some have done, is to miss its roots entirely. People are not wrong to feel the system has betrayed them. The evidence of this betrayal is undeniable. The true danger arises when that legitimate anger is misdirected, exploited, and manipulated by leaders who prioritize their own interests over the welfare of the people they claim to represent. The endurance of this anger means that Trump's political decline, if it occurs, will not mark the end of populist politics in America. On the contrary, it could signal the beginning of a more unpredictable phase. His legal troubles might weaken his personal credibility, but they will not resolve the underlying issues that fueled his rise. The deep-rooted dissatisfaction will continue to search for a new voice, a fresh leader, and an alternative outlet. That is why Trump's current plight should not be seen as the final chapter, but as part of a much longer ongoing narrative. The anger that propelled him to the presidency is still very much alive, and it will continue to shape American politics long after his personal fate is sealed. The deeper crisis surrounding Trump reveals an even more profound truth. Without addressing the structural inequalities embedded in capitalism itself, the United States will continue to produce figures like him, and they may become stronger, more strategic, and even more dangerous. The American economic system has, for generations, been founded on the promise of upward mobility in exchange for hard work and discipline. For most working families, that promise has long been shattered. Adjusted for inflation, wages have stayed mostly stagnant since the 1970s, while the cost of basics like housing, education, and healthcare has skyrocketed. Meanwhile, worker productivity has surged. but the financial benefits have been funneled almost entirely to the top 1%. Corporations are raking in record profits, stock markets are soaring, the number of billionaires continues to rise, while ordinary Americans face mounting debt and persistent financial instability. This glaring inequality is not a random flaw in the system. It's the inevitable result of an economic model that prioritizes capital over labor. In this environment, it was only a matter of time before widespread frustration found a political outlet. Trump was one such figure, but as long as the system remains unchanged, others will inevitably take his place. The danger isn't just that history will repeat itself, it's that it could escalate. Trump's populism was often chaotic and filled with contradictions. He mixed anti-elite rhetoric with pro-business policies, promising to fight for workers while cutting taxes for the wealthiest corporations. Eventually, these contradictions undermined his credibility. But future political figures who learn from his mistakes could craft a more disciplined, effective form of populism, one that blends cultural resentment with economic messaging in a way that's harder to counter. Yes, Trump's situation is worse than I expected. But the real crisis, the one we can't afford to ignore, is the plight of working Americans stuck in this broken economic system. Trump's downfall might satisfy some, but it won't solve the deeper issues. The core question is clear. Will we continue to let this system produce demagogues and disasters? Or will we use this moment to demand an economy that benefits everyone, not just the wealthy? That is the challenge history has set before us. To truly understand this cycle, we must also scrutinize the failures of the mainstream political opposition. The void Trump exploited wasn't created overnight. It was carved out over decades by a political establishment, including the Democratic Party, that failed to offer a compelling alternative to the erosion of the American working and middle classes. Instead of tackling the root causes of inequality, the mainstream opposition offered a vision of managed decline, with modest safety nets and cultural progressivism, while leaving the economic structures of neoliberalism intact. They supported trade deals that promoted outsourcing, deregulated finance that benefited Wall Street, and a healthcare system that remained tied to private insurers. To millions of voters, this seemed less like a real alternative and more like a slightly more polite version of the same system that had failed them. This failure eroded public trust, reinforcing the idea that both parties served corporate interests, making Trump's outsider status more convincing. When the choice is between a chaotic demagogue who at least acknowledges your anger and a political establishment indifferent to your struggles, the appeal of the demagogue becomes dangerously understandable. This dynamic sets the stage for what follows. The unresolved anger driving Trump's movement is a potent political force, now in search of a new leader. A future populist, one who learns from both Trump's victories and failures, could pose an even greater threat. Picture someone who shares Trump's knack for tapping into cultural grievances but avoids his self-destructive behavior and legal troubles. A more controlled, articulate, and ideologically consistent leader could wield that same public outrage with surgical precision, masking an authoritarian agenda in a more appealing form. This is not idle conjecture. It is the logical outcome for a society that refuses to confront its deep economic flaws. The drama of Trump's fall may bring short-term relief, but it's a dangerous distraction if it prevents a deeper reckoning. Defeating one man isn't a win if the circumstances that created him are left unchecked. The real challenge is not just stopping the next Trump, but building a political movement so compelling, so grounded in economic fairness, and so dedicated to the well-being of the many that there's no longer space for demagogues to thrive. Without such a movement, we're merely biding our time until the next, more skilled authoritarian steps up to fill a stage we failed to dismantle.